Great. Okay, I think we've got a good size group here. We'll still have a couple folks trickle in, but I just want to go ahead and welcome you all. My name is Dana Childress. I am the head of our Leading Places to Work team here at Leading Edge. I've seen many of you on multiple sessions this summer as part of our After Survey Action series, and we are excited today to continue the conversation about compensation, which has been our theme for the month of September. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by two of our partners from OpenComp, Tang and Emily, who are going to introduce themselves momentarily and have a conversation about meeting the pay transparency moment. We know that compensation is very much on the minds of our organizations at Leading Edge, both ongoing throughout the year and becomes more salient when we take a look at our employee experience survey results. And so today we wanted to invite them on to share some content to give us more history and context around pay transparency and some actionable strategies that you can put into place if this is something that you at your organization are really thinking about. They're going to speak for a good portion of the call, but we are going to make sure that we save some time at the end for Q&A. And we've already gotten a couple of really great questions that some folks have submitted in advance, so thank you for doing so. So we ask that if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or when we get to the section at the end to come off mute and be able to voice your question out loud. Because we are always asked, we are recording this call and we are going to send out the slides after. So obviously feel free to take notes, but we encourage you to just kind of sit back and listen because we'll make sure that you get that content at the end as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you all.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks,
Thank you, Dana. Yeah, Leah, thank you so much. Thanks to Leading Edge for inviting us and hosting this session as part of the After Survey Action series. We're really thrilled to be here. We want to thank you for joining us on a topic that Tang and I literally think about pretty much every single day, 24/7 through our work at OpenComp. And actually today is International Pay Equity Day. So this conversation is even that much more timely. So let me take a minute. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Emily Sweet. I'm Vice President of Social Impact at OpenComp, and I'm joined by my colleague Tang Nguyen, who's co-founder and founding CEO of OpenComp. So a little bit about me. This is actually my first foray into the corporate sector. I've spent my entire career actually working in the nonprofit sector and actually spent 10 years working in the Chicago Jewish communal sector. And I have some of my former colleagues I saw are on the call today. But I am really thrilled to be here. As I said, I lead our social impact work, and I am the lead exec for our Open Imperative Coalition, which is a pay equity coalition, which we'll share a little bit more about at the end of this call. Tang, turning it to you for intros.
Thank you, Emily. I've been a comp expert and a HR operator for 20 plus years, former consultant, and ultimately ended up broadening my HR experience and kind of compensation at Salesforce, little company called Salesforce.com when I started, but close to a decade there. And then really my heart obviously lied in the growth technology side of things. And I really kind of worked to help growth companies kind of figure out their HR operating models. And really was the journey that led me to founding OpenComp, which really is focused on helping companies kind of discover and execute on their compensation philosophies. As part of that compensation philosophy, the kernel or the importance of data that supports pay transparency and pay equity is of the utmost forefront in what we do. So just really excited to be here talking to you about this. It has been my life's work as well, more so on this comp and data side, but the impacts of pay transparency are definitely there. So.
All right. Okay, so today we are going to be diving into the conversation around compensation. And we're going to, as Tang mentioned, we alluded to, really have a specific focus on advancing pay transparency and ultimately pay equity within your organization. So these are our goals for the next hour. We're going to start by sharing some context on the current state of play in pay equity and pay transparency today. We'll talk about why getting this work right really matters to your organization. And we'll give you some concrete steps and actions that you can begin incorporating in your organizations today that will set you up for success. As Dana mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, so please be sure to submit your questions, put them in the chat. We'll continue to monitor those. And then we'll leave you also with some helpful and free resources and ways to connect with us afterwards if you have any questions or if there's ways that we can be helpful to you. So hopefully that all sounds good. All right. So before we dive into more of the meaty discussion, we really want to hear from you all. We're going to launch a quick poll. So if you could just take a minute to answer this question, and how would you assess and rate your pay equity practices within your organization? We know that meeting pay transparency regulations can be really challenging for organizations. And so while we're waiting for the poll results, I'd like to share some of the findings from a survey that OpenComp ran in 2023, earlier this year. It was our State of Pay Equity Report. And this reflects the responses from over 500 CEOs and executives of organizations of 5,000 employees or less across the country. And our findings really found some interesting discrepancy. And it showed that while the majority of CEOs, just over a majority, believe that their companies are doing an excellent job addressing pay equity and pay transparency, 70% of their teams did not feel that they were set up with the right resources to make pay equity a reality, which was an astounding increase of 25% over the previous year, which is pretty staggering. So clearly this is something that's top of mind. Lee, I don't know if you can show the results. Let's see. Okay, developing. I think that's fair. So thank you. It's good to get a sense of where you are all at, because this is exactly what we're going to be diving into and talking about today. All right. So let's take a few minutes just to set a little bit of the context for this conversation. And here we're going to share some pretty sobering statistics. The first statistic, and we can switch, there we go. You might have seen before. It's a statistic that comes from the US Census Bureau. And the 83 cents to the dollar represents the average gender pay gap for women who are full-time year-round workers. And that number is reflected from 2022. And while 83 cents is a disheartening number, really want to call out and take note that that number actually drops to 67 cents for Black women and 52 cents for Latina women. And so there is clearly a lot of work to do nationally around the gender and race pay gaps. Now, we know that the gender pay gap exists in all sectors, including the nonprofit sector. And the National Council of Nonprofits reported that females on average earn around almost 25% less on average than males in the sector. And according to the American Association of University Women, while women make up 75% of nonprofit employees, only 22% of nonprofits are run by women executive directors or CEOs. And so it's just important to take a moment to really reflect on what the reality of this pay gap has on individual employees, because the consequences are very real for individuals, their families, and their communities. And ultimately, these types of gaps and inequities can cost women hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in lost income over the course of their professional careers, and also have real implications for wealth generation for your employees, their families, and future generations. And this is why, as women, we know that the stakes are really high when we're figuring out our own salary and compensation, and when we try to negotiate our own salaries. And unfortunately, this has been the way that things have really played out for decades. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act, and yet still here we are. And we are in this place because for far too long, the onus has really been on individual employees to try to fix a broken system, an inequitable system on their own. Because for far too long, compensation and pay has really been sort of shrouded in this veil of secrecy and ambiguity, and really sort of disjointed from candidates. And things now are shifting. Right now, the landscape looks very, very different than it did from just a few years ago. And new pay transparency laws are getting passed at significant rates across the country. And it is these disparities that I just highlighted that the laws are really working to address. Because when you advance pay transparency, it is a critical step on the path to addressing pay equity overall. Now, as you'll see from this map, you really can tell that we are starting to hit a pay equity tipping point. Today, 22 states and 21 cities have some form of pay transparency laws on the books. And many more states are beginning to require employers to post salary ranges in all job listings. We've seen this trend started in Colorado, moved to Washington, California, New York City, and New York State, and is coming to Illinois, which is where I'm based, next year. Now, we're curious to see how many of you are operating in states or cities where you have to post pay ranges. So if you want to put that in the chat, we can get a sense of where you're all located. And you can maybe indicate whether it's something that's been easy for you to start doing or if it's getting a little bit more complicated. But what's significant is that today, 1 in 5 US workers now lives in a place where employers are legally required by law to post pay ranges. So pretty significant and pretty dramatic shifts from just a couple years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that the impacts to businesses and operators that have to manage this and just getting the reporting and the compliance correct is very large and it's very complex, right? Our dear friends over at Gender Fair, Noreen Farrell, who helped, was part of the team that kind of initiated the California legislation, says there's 13 more coming, right? So it's very clear that nationally, this is afoot, and we're going to have to respond to it from an operator's mindset and a compliance mindset. Let alone the international implications already. We're already seeing this in the EU, and they're well ahead of where we're at today, even from a regulation, compliance, and quite frankly, the fees and the fines, right? So we're just starting this process out in the US, and you'll hear me say this later, but good faith is right now. So, but that's going to end very shortly, right? And we'll talk about some of the implications of that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, we can move to the next slide because really this is shifting now. So we know this is a reality. If it hasn't come for your state or city yet, it is coming, as Tang just mentioned. So let's talk about how this is really impacting employers and ultimately why this is a topic that matters to your organization, because we know that getting this work right really, really does matter. And for those of you who maybe are still trying to get leadership buy-in from your execs on really trying to advance pay transparency measures within your organization, hopefully these next slides and some of these stats that we're going to talk about will be really relevant to you. So let's just start with some of the pain points, because we know that addressing these new pay transparency regulations can be challenging. They can cause a lot of heartburn and they can cause organizations to have to really implement new practices and maybe they were not prepared or equipped to do. But especially for those of you who are now required to start posting salary ranges, but who have not yet done the internal work to set up those ranges and communicate them across your organization with your team members, again, this can cause a lot of strain. And it's really forcing organizations to develop new practices before they've kind of gotten their house in order. So helping you get your house in order is what we're going to be talking about in a little bit. But Tang, do you want to touch on these next few ones?
Yeah, look, I think, the reality is we're really kind of focused on not for profit and the organizations that you support. But when you think about the private sector and the commercial private sector, and quite frankly, the public companies, these are leading indicators of what other businesses generally will have to endure or have to figure out. So as I said, these filings and these reports have made it up into public companies. They have to file this within their SEC filings that generally happen every quarter, right? We're actually also seeing this in private equity and venture-backed investors, right? We're seeing this requirement in terms of transparency and pay parity in investment manifestos that will ultimately impact where dollars go, right? And I think for number 3, look, we said this earlier, there's a lot of leeway right now, a lot of good faith, and the reality is it's going to get much more stringent. We've spoken with the folks at the Civil Rights Department who handles the pay requirements and the reporting for the state of California. And they've confirmed that, the first initial years, they want to allow companies to kind of figure out how to organize And organization is really complex. What comes with this reporting is a 90-page document that Emily and I kind of read through, but because it was so dense and really complex. But these are the type of things, and it's not easy, you all, in terms of pinching all of this data together and making sure that you're compliant on that. So that's definitely causing a lot of consternation and angst amongst folks. And then, from a brand and the ramifications, I think, talent still rules generally. And I think replacing talent is costly and it's super expensive, right? It takes 6 to 8 months to onboard new talent, and managing churn and impact of that and just really impacts the bottom line of a company. So it's a huge sunk cost. And we'll talk about what the next generation are demanding and requiring as it relates to companies and the transparency. Right. And then, as related to that, I think Adobe had a future work survey last year come out. And within that, some really compelling statistics. Gen Z will make up a third of the workforce by 2030. Right. And they've actually explicitly stated that they are demanding pay transparency. They won't even look at a job posting without that. So think about the impact of not being able to attract or even retain talent because you don't have the supporting infrastructure to deliver transparency in a way that the labor markets or the supply of labor won't view you as a credible operating company, right?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, yeah, Tang, if you want to move to the next slide, because we also found that in the same survey also showed that almost a third of respondents said they felt that it made an organization look untrustworthy if they didn't include salary information in the job post. So it's something really to think about. And I just want to take a minute to pull in some of the findings from the Leading Edge survey that are relevant to this point specifically. So of the compensation questions that were asked, 41% of respondents agreed with the statement that they understand how their salaries and raises are determined at their organization. So that's means the majority of respondents did not agree with that survey. And similarly, 38% of respondents agreed with the statement, my organization takes action to improve our approach to compensation, such as creating salary bands, communicating an approach to compensation, and defining how raises happen. So again, a pretty significant majority disagrees with that statement. And while there were signs, especially in that first question, there was a little bit of progress made over the previous year. This data really suggests for the Jewish communal sector that there's some work to do in terms of transparency. You already all identified that in the poll as well, but just wanted to really call attention to this too. And then Tang, if you want to move to the next slide. Another thing that's really interesting about Gen Z, and not to sort of like keep harping on them, but generally they have a very different comfort level with talking about their own salaries and calling out bad behavior online in kind of public ways on social media. And so again, even just within the last few years, seeing these trends of folks getting online and, calling out their employers, applying for their own jobs that are listed at higher salaries than what they're making. I mean, these are things that are just really important macro trends for employers to keep in mind and to be focused on. And then just again, a couple more data points, Tang, you can move to that next slide, that we also know that 70% of workers say that they would switch to a more transparent employer, even if their salary remained the same. And these are employees across all generations. And again, just to, kind of pinpoint some of the stats that Tang brought up earlier, these fines and fees can get very costly. Departments are, state departments are starting to take note of this, and, more legislation is coming. So this is a trend that really has sort of like left the station, if you will. But there's good news on the flip side of this coin, and that we know that companies that prioritize pay equity really see outsized benefits to their organizations. And data shows that organizations that embrace pay transparency have almost 20% higher acceptance rates. They have retention rates that hover at 90%. And a survey from Deloitte indicated that companies that really prioritize pay transparency ultimately are more likely to hit or exceed financial targets. And so while maybe that's in a for-profit setting, it's obviously very relevant in terms of fundraising goals for organization, but this data point is relevant for nonprofits too, because it really speaks to the outsized benefit you get around employee engagement and motivation and connection to the organization. So bottom line, key takeaway is that it pays to do this work well. All right, so next slide, please. And given all of this, we really are starting to see a very dramatic shift in employers' embrace of pay transparency. Generally, these are some other findings from our State of Pay Equity survey. 91% of execs say addressing pay equity is now a business imperative, which was a 20% jump from the previous year. And so the good news is we know companies really are committed to this. They believe in it. They know it's something they need to do. They just don't know how to get started. So that's what we're going to shift gears and start talking about right now. Because getting this work right, again, helping you meet this new pay transparency moment is what we're here to talk about today. And Tang, I'm going to turn it over to you now to walk us through the next couple slides.
Great. Thanks, Em. So look, for us at OpenComp, the journey in terms of building helping companies build out this compensation journey and strategy is really all underpinned by like data and data transparency. So this is what lines up really well for us. And I will say that pay transparency can't really be done without good compensation practices, right? So we're going to talk about the outcome of pay transparency and what you have to do to get there next. So I'm going to leave this up for a second just so you guys can kind of read this. But look, in a nutshell, pay transparency in talking to customers and a lot of the business stakeholders within organizations, it's something different to everybody. That definition is different to everybody. And I'm sure those that have dealt with this internally have heard some of this within their own organizations. And when everybody has a different opinion on pay transparency, you ultimately have to be adaptive, but it becomes very complex and difficult to support operationally, right? Everybody having different opinions on data. The reality is you're probably experiencing, recruitment awareness or knowledge of your comp philosophy. That's virtually impossible to manage with, the policy side versus keeping everything with the ranges and everything in an order where the dynamic marketplace is invoking all these changes with labor and what the perception of employee pay should be, right? So you've got, from an operational perspective, that confusion with your recruiters. You've got scattered documents and manual processes that you're handling. You are actually dealing with probably data that is stale and compensation plans that are siloed within the organization. I don't know about you guys, but even getting approval for, new hires or kind of that workflow is really complex internally, and how many people have to touch it and how much kind of context delivery you have to have. And the reality is most organizations are, in an HR perspective and an operations perspective, at a deficit in that resource. So how do you supply all that information, that tangible, what we call business data, to the people that are actually making those decisions for, your merit cycles, your offer letters? So what I'm highlighting here is the complexity just to establish the operating models for this. And ultimately, when you don't have that sorted or figured out, or you haven't invested into that scale or that fundamental kind of framework, what do you have? You got frustrated recruiters. You got frustrated people managers, hiring managers, execs, and more importantly, your talent, not only from that new hire that you're trying to attract, but the retention of your existing talent are frustrated, and they don't ultimately become distrusting of that employer-employee relationship, right? So it just kind of underscores for us what you have to do to get this right, right? And it starts with I'm going to talk about the 4 stages that we really are going to talk through in the second half. But, people talk about pay transparency, and the thing that always comes to mind for me when I relate pay transparency is consistency. You can't get to transparency without a consistent operating model. And it's about creating a compensation plan that drives that consistency, because compensation is a loop. You have to do it regularly. You have to do it multiple times a year, depending on your cycles. And if you don't have a consistent approach in executing and activating your compensation strategy, then basically you introduce bias and distrust in that relationship, right? So we'll go through what I'll talk about, the 4 pillars for us, which is kind of the market data, the benchmarking, really comparing one's organization to an external marketplace that helps you kind of understand whether you're paying fairly from an external marketplace perspective. The second being plan design and compensation philosophy. And we'll get into the details. It's not a pie in the sky type of statement. It is really a statement that allows you some grounding principles on how you kind of check what you're doing is fair and in alignment with what you want to deliver from a core comp delivery perspective. We'll talk about the activation of compensation. There's the design side, and then there's actually when you activate it in the field. And you heard me say managers and recruiters. We'll talk about that. The communication is critical. Once you do all of this work, there's a huge chasm, right? You've done all this great work, but if you don't communicate and you don't articulate the finer points, one doesn't, especially an employee, doesn't understand how they're being rewarded or evaluated as part of that reward and how that connects to your compensation philosophy. Okay. And at the end of the day, all of this, because of the regulations, have to be supported by compliance, reporting, and the operations. Otherwise, the new regulations are really going to kind of set you back. Okay. So I love this kind of map. I know it's kind of simple and oversimplified, but I'm going to leave it up for a second. Right. So as a compensation professional, you see on the left side here, kind of program design, right? And then within this journey, you heard me say, this is a loop. It is. Compensation is a loop. You have to do it consistently all the time. And on the right-hand side, you'll see this implementation, right? Everybody's going to have to deal with this at some point, right? Whether you're small, medium, or large, the nuance or the scale from which you're doing it is going to be different. But generally speaking, everybody has this type of cycle. And we'll just go through it really quick. You heard me talk about market data, benchmarking analysis, the comp philosophy, right? Everything to the left, it has to be fundamentally, doable in your organization, meaning you can't go out and try to hire like folks from Amazon, Google, or Meta, these days, and you being like us, a Series A early stage company, right? We have to really work within the envelopes of who we are and defining who we are. And then again, the activation of that. And, activation is critical because we as operators or HR professionals don't actually deliver compensation. We're building and doing all the work and setting up the framework, but we have to train and deliver via our recruiters, via our operating hiring managers, our people managers. We have to enable them with the tools and the data and then actually the programmatic insights on how your compensation strategy works. And 25 years plus years of this, I've helped so many companies on the left-hand side deliver this, and they fail to actually work on the right-hand side of activating this and really focusing on the training and the L&D that happens throughout and really getting the fundamental principles. Okay. So when we talk about that stage one, right, that benchmarking and getting that compensation level right, I think it's always important to help your organization understand that no one job type or level is actually the same. And I think people conflate that as to, hey, that's fairness. And the reality is there are different contributing roles, different impacts to that business. And you have to ultimately understand that in terms of the development of your structure. And part of doing that is a process called benchmarking and leveling. And this is so critical because it helps you organize the role types and the levels. And I hate to use the word hierarchy within your organization, but for a lack of better term, there are going to be senior professionals that are absolutely critical, or critical individual contributors that, quite frankly, impact the business so much that if they left, things might break in your organization. And that's true because they're wearing multiple hats or dimensions, or they have a skill set around fundraising, et cetera, all those things. But we have to be very clear in doing that work and developing and identifying that framework. A lot of companies go off and don't do this. And essentially that's the missing element. That's the missing kind of, hey, you do this within our organization, and we see this as critical in this way. Therefore, we're basically benchmarking and leveling this role type. And within those leveling rubrics, it's really critical to be able to articulate where one sits within the organization. Because at the end of the day, if you don't do that, again, the activation side, how is your people managers going to basically articulate where an individual sits or how they respond within your organization, right? So this is really critical. It helps kind of, set the tone for your compensation philosophy, right? And comp philosophy, I think, for a venture-backed company, obviously, is much different than not-for-profits or organizations that are not profit-driven or profit or growth motivated in the same way. So philosophy is really important. What are you trying to deliver? And it's not always cash or equity in the world that I'm used to seeing. Today, I think, are you talking about your compensation and philosophy in learning and development? There's other benefits, there's other attributes that are more meaningful, the type of work that you're doing, the skills that you are focusing on. These are really critical because that's also really critical to defining how you're going to manage that pay and that administration. And I know that there's some questions around merit cycles and COLA and all those things that goes into the same framework of philosophy, right? And I think that's a definition that you have to really incorporate on how you're going to define your pay in your organization and how you're going to activate where somebody sits within a salary band or a total cash band and a benefits and other maybe perks that benefit your workers, right? So again, this is all about using that information to develop and give you a checkpoint on how you're delivering your pay, right? You heard me talk about the job leveling framework as it relates to organizing and categorizing individuals into your company. Now, when you take that framework and you apply what we're talking about in pay transparency and the reporting, you have to actually deliver a range, a total cash range or a base salary range, and across your organization, whether that's in external postings or whether it's internal within the organization. So as part of our process, again, kind of compensation geek speak, you take third-party market data, and that could be relative to geo, it could be relative to the talent that you have to compete with amongst other industries, et cetera. But once you define that, you're taking that third-party market data and using that information to develop your market positioning strategy and taking that kind of what we call raw market data and developing your salary bands, right? And your total cost bands in your organizations. Now, when you do that, not to get too dense, basically everyone in your organization ultimately sits within a salary range that's relative to what they do in your organization and how you use that third-party market data to define your midpoints and your kind of minimum and your maxes of that range. Now, what that creates is a distribution from which you can manage pay throughout the life of that employee, right? So as you can imagine, think about it like an upside down triangle. Normally, as you get more senior in your role, you have a larger range spread, right? And roles that occupy a larger scope and responsibility or P&L that have a larger range spread. But That's how organizations pay administer. And this is really important as it relates to your COLA, as it relates to your comp cycles, because that impacts the speed or the rate from when somebody's moving within that range or they're looking at promotions. So I hate to get too detailed into this, but this is the operator's mindset in terms of developing that sound structure, right? Because that's the information that ultimately allows HR professionals and operators to actually organize distribution of pay within their companies. Okay. Now, say we've done that, right? Stage 2 is like, okay, we've got everybody organized and we're about to move into the activation side, and we've done the learning and development. And when we think about pay transparency, I always say that, hey, it's a spectrum. Again, we go back to that gram of everybody having a different opinion around what they need for data as it relates to pay transparency. When you look at pay here, look on the far right side, if you're absolutely open and you're full throttle on your pay, meaning everybody knows what everybody is making, you've got to have a lot of training and education around this, and you've got to have a lot of tools around this. I think a lot of good operators, good operating models kind of settle in between that's, the top third here, but we rarely see the edges of that. But you can't really do this without stage 1 being prepared and done, right? And this is really critical. And I think there's a lot of myths around pay transparency and how to get there. And we just want to be there to debunk that by really kind of giving very clear operating models to actually execute and support this pay transparency spectrum that you see. Okay. All right. So when we talk about stage 2, after you get through that and you've kind of defined how you want to articulate and talk about your pay, this is what your employees actually receive, right? When you think about that left or the right-hand side of that roadmap, employees are more interested in understanding how it impacts them, quite frankly. So when we think about the kind of the updates, the compensation updates, some of the most basic things you want to be able to articulate are, what is your compensation schedule? Is it an annual? Is it biannual? Right? Is it based on an anniversary date? Some organizations that are really small in size can do anniversary dates, but as they migrate in kind of their maturity and their employee size, they have to scale it through an annual focal review process, which many of you have probably participated in, right? Things like the compensation review cycle, what's included, is it merit? Is it, from a tech perspective, is it like an equity grant or some other kind of long-term bonus plan, etc.? Do promotions occur within those cycles, right? Again, these all link up to that program development. And this is about pay transparency, right? When we talk about the pay guidelines, right, this is impacting not only the internal relationship with external relationship, right? Meaning if you're going out and hiring new employees, right, or new candidates, are they in line with your existing candidates? And is that pay internal parity being balanced or not, right? How do you evaluate for that? Because that's absolutely really critical. Are you bringing those new employees at midpoint or at the upper end or the lower end of those ranges that you developed, right? Do you have a no negotiating process with these employees? And, these are extremely critical in identifying and articulating to your employee base, because again, this is what they're receiving out of that plan development that you have, right? And performance management always comes up. Like, how does COLA impact what I receive today? Or how does the third-party market data, because of the role that I'm in today, change over time? We know that from what we recently experienced a year ago, compensation has changed dramatically today than what it was a year ago, just based on the economy, right? So how do we stay on top of that? How do we articulate to our employees what we're doing there, right? So these are critical in establishing and being able to articulate, because you have to, for a lot of the work that I've done in terms of employee engagement and training, most employees are very sensible around this stuff. Their biggest kind of bone to pick is really around, hey, give me the rules of how we operate and how I can perform and how I can see my compensation kind of be reflected in pay. A lot of organizations, again, just don't have that framework built out. Therefore, you get to a certain point, then distrust creeps in, and next thing you know, you have a major problem on your hands. And I've seen companies, quite frankly, basically go under because of a mass exodus of employee trust. Now that's an extreme case, but if you don't get a hold of this and you let bias and you let kind of transactional compensation occur within your organization without a good sense of how you're doing it and the consistency, then this is an outcome that you don't want, right? So,
Okay. Yeah. Do you want me to,
Emily?
I can move. Yeah, I can do these.
Yeah, I think I've kind of logged us down a little bit here, so we're going to keep moving.
We'll keep moving. We've got a few more slides, and then we really want to make sure to open it up to Q&A. There's been some good questions already in the chat, and I started to respond. It's like too much multitasking, so we'll save them. But this next stage is really important because communicating it with, this with your candidates as well. These are just some really good best practice tips. I think, to call one out, and I saw a few folks in the chat are even posting ranges in their jobs, which is great, even though they're not required to. The more transparent you can be, it will have really outsized benefits on your organization. The one I really want to call out is just really thinking about how you're going to handle negotiations. And again, I think this is one of the benefits of having pay ranges and really clearly established pay ranges, because it helps limit bias that can creep in as part of a negotiation process, which can then result in ultimate equity. And if someone's a better negotiator or stronger negotiator than others, that's where you can really start to have some challenges. So when you have very clearly articulated salary bands, that can really help address some of that. And Melissa, I know you asked a question of sort of what that range could be. We can definitely get into that as part of the Q&A, but just really want to call that out and to articulate to your candidate up front too. Like if you really are not, if you don't, we are encouraging a lot of organizations to actually move away from negotiations, ultimately, if you're really clear about how your comp is established, and you can really communicate that with candidates at the onset as well. So we'll move on to this next one. This next stage is really about just how do you sustain some of these practices moving on? Because as Ting mentioned, this is a cycle. It's an ever evolving journey. And I would say the one to really call out here in particular is the importance of conducting pay equity assessments and audits for your organization. This is something that we encourage organizations to do at least once a year, if not more frequently, because with every new hire, every time somebody leaves, the dynamic of your, and the makeup of your organization is going to shift. But we encourage you to take a look, look at how, your employees are being paid by gender, by race and ethnicity. Do an intersectional analysis of the two. Look at it across departments and across job levels to see if there are specific areas where you need to dig in and there might be some pain points for your organization. And we just, we really encourage you to do this. It helps you spot problems before they get sort of exacerbated over time. And, we have some free resources we can offer up that provides those kind of reports for you all. So just really want to call that out specific. Tang, I don't know if there's anything else on this one you want to mention.
Yeah, look, I think it's pay transparency, again, it's a spectrum, right? So it happens over a loop of time, right? So the more we are articulating the details of your compensation strategy and actually providing that communication and that L&D, even if there are macro changes, it becomes more critical in terms of getting that alignment across your whole organization, right? So
yeah. All right. So these are the 5 critical actions we would leave you with as, you're working to advance these practices in your company, in your organization, just really focusing on comp philosophy, pay ranges, the communication, tracking the promotions and performance reviews is another way that you can potentially spot inequities, and running those pay equity reports. All right. We're going to do one poll. Maybe what we can do is we can put the previous slide up. Just we're curious to get a sense of how many of these actions you're currently taking in your organization. Feel free to take a minute to do that. And while you're doing that, I wanted to just call out a question in the chat about why not asking about previous salary history. And it's a great question. The short answer is that it's actually becoming illegal in more states than not to ask a candidate about their previous salary history, because what it can ultimately do is it can lead to perpetuating inequity. So if someone was previously not paid fairly or below market in their previous position, and that's what they're coming in for, saying that was their previous salary history, they're not necessarily getting paid at the same rate that you would pay somebody coming in for that position. And so when you are really clear about your pay ranges for a specific job, previous salary history should actually be irrelevant, because you're paying someone based on their skills and what the current value is of that position. But also importantly, it is becoming more illegal to do that. So it's a really good thing to shy away from through your organization.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, employees actually, or candidates, have a right to request a salary ban from a employer in the state of California. And I know that other laws like that exist in kind of the states that we're talking about. So
yeah, that sounds great. All right, well, let's open it up now. We will leave you, we're going to do some Q&A. We want to make sure, we'll share some of these results. Yes, thanks. It's good to see. It's good to see. I'm just reading through this. All right, thank you. Well, let's get into it. Let's see if there are specific questions about any of the things that we covered. We want to make sure that we're addressing your needs. I know there was one in the chat. Tang, we can talk about this one first, was around what's a considerable, like a reasonable range to post? Like what would be a reasonable spread? And maybe if you could talk about, how you would make decisions around having your pay ranges be narrower or wider, and what the implications for doing one or the other would be.
yeah, I mean, the range spread, obviously, it really does tie to the philosophy, but there are some that we've seen, quite frankly, that have been just millions, right? Quite frankly, and they're kind of funny, because obviously what that does is tarnishes the brand. But when we're traditionally building ranges for companies, we either see, from the midpoint, just think about it as kind of the midpoint and the wings of the range spectrum. It's about 15 to 20% on either side. But obviously, those are depending on kind of the roles that are associated to it. As I said to you before, view it kind of as an upside down triangle, right? So as you get kind of more of that entry or very specialized role, you're going to have a much smaller range spread articulation. And then as you get larger in scope and you're wearing more hats or the responsibilities of scope of the role, it's much larger. So there's more fluidity on that. But even with that said, if you have a very large range spread, there are segments within that range, or quartiles that we'll call out, that allow you to manage that distribution, right? So if a company has a small range spread, you're probably going to be promoting much quicker in your organization, right? If your company has a very large range spread, you're not promoting within that role as quickly. So there's consequences on how you do that. And the impact of that ties back to the compensation philosophy, the type of company that you want to be in, right? But we can go deeper into how you can build the appropriate range spread for the role types and the location that you have, because that is all very critical in kind of this range development aspect.
Hey, I had a question.
Yeah, hey, Jim.
Hey, it's
Hey,
Jim. Tang, good to see you again, Tang.
Good to see you.
You talked earlier about how folks would be at different levels of a band based on more critical or just different areas of work within the organization. Could you speak a bit about job families within an organization? Because, for many of us, we've got fundraisers, we've got program people, we've got technology people, accounting people, and I just feel like it would be helpful to kind of clarify kind of how that process plays itself out in terms of establishing ranges and bands for different types of people who are really doing different kind of work in the organization.
And I could take that, or you want to? I think that's the process of doing the external third-party market data, right? The reality is accountant is paid differently than a software engineer in kind of the technology space, right? Similarly. So what we try to do, and this is why this process is really critical in taking, the external market data that helps you understand a fair and competitive wage, because what they're doing is they're tracking people's pay, and generally it's annually, whether it's within a certain window, but it gives you an indication of what is fair pay for a said skill set. Now, let's just go through the example. If you're a level 6 that requires a CPA and an MBA, et cetera, there are skills that are nested within that ultimately fundamentally support that market-based pay. So when you take that and compare it internally, that's going to give you the gradation or dimensions that you're using to build your internal ranges. So what happens is you're building clusters based on that third market data around what you're going to pay within your organization. Now, that senior kind of controller may sit at a higher range than somebody within that organization that is a kind of just coming into their career with 2 to 3 years. They're in the same fundamental job family, but they're not in the same range because of the dynamic of market pay, right? Does that make sense? Or am I kind of munging things up? But you have to do that within the organization. So when you organize based on market data and what's relative to your own organization as it relates to importance, you start to get a cluster of like for like jobs, right? Or like for like roles that's supported and defensible by your market strategy, right? And your market strategy could say, look, we're going to pay at the 60th percentile for all of our operators, and our operators that sit in a location and or these departments are going to fall within this dimension, and they're building out that salary range using that market data. And those that aren't, you're going to have another set of ranges for. So ranges, again, are not this notion that everybody is the same across the board, because the dimensions of skills are very different, right? And how you identify them. But that's why this is so critical. And I kick this all the time, and I really focus on it, because you can't get to pay transparency if you can't articulate the details on how you organize your labor within your company. So it's all very nested on how we identify these, and you get really down to kind of the jobs and the skills that support that job, right? But all of that is great hygiene too.
All right, we've got a couple more questions that are really good in the chat. So and I think you're the best to answer. This first one is really around how do you reconcile different union contracts with the non-union staff? So I think for many of the organizations on the call, having different unions with different negotiated pay rates and bands for similar positions, which is potentially different from the non-bargaining, categories of workers. So do you have thoughts for an organization on how to manage that process?
I think you hit it on the head. You have to view them as separate, and there's data that supports union data, right, and non-union data, right? So if you have that, the reality is your workforce is just much more complex, and you have to develop these structures separately. You can't conjoin them. That's my personal opinion. Otherwise, yeah, you just mixing apples and oranges together due to the nature of that union, right? So the limited work that I've personally done on this, that's how we've chose to approach it, just to be very clear and concise about those two different frameworks.
Sounds good. All right, we've got a couple other questions before I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I know people might need to jump a little early. I just want to offer, Ting, if you want to just advance, we've got a bunch of resources you can all feel free to access. And I would just really encourage you, if you are interested, if you have specific questions, Ting and I are so happy to do, consultations with anybody that are participating on this call. So feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. We can answer. If we don't have time to get to your specific question or something really specific for your organization, we're happy to chat afterwards. Our contact information is here. You can also email us. I'm at emily@opencomp.com. So feel free, just wanted to put that up there. But in terms of another question that is in the chat, Tang, was around tying yearly performance reviews to compensation and salary increases. So do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the pros and cons of, keeping them together or keeping them separate? And I have, some thoughts I can jump in as well, but feel free to start us out.
Look, I think it's important to understand performance. I'm a big believer in that, but there's certain organizations, quite frankly, like the fidelity of the roles, it's hard to articulate kind of like that performance criteria, right? I'll give you kind of a business case where, if you've got an early stage company or a company that is developing or understanding or building new things, those metrics aren't really defined. You're still learning. You're taking on a ton of information as a team and as a group, and everybody's wearing a lot of different multiple hats, and you're more nimble in that way. And organizations that have that or have that kind of operating model, it's hard to define that specific performance criteria. So in that way, that performance for that company could be one where you're doing more of a team-based performance, where everybody, assuming that they're performing and clipping at a kind of a North Star, so to speak, is operating in good faith that they're performing, and you do more of a group reward in that way. And you see a lot of that, right? I think as companies get more mature and they get a lot more specialized in roles, and there's more employee types, and you can really define that, you start to see that pay per performance as it relates to individual and corporate or kind of broader organizational goals. But, it is all around understanding the KPIs and the drivers for that organization. And you could have different, setups for different organizations. I mean, different departments in your organization, right?
Sounds good.
I hate to end us because I feel like there's so much good discussion, but just a big thank you to Emily and Tang for being here and sharing your wisdom with all of us, and to all of you for participating and sharing great questions. Please fill out our feedback form if you'll have a moment. Just a reminder, we'll send all this good stuff out, including the recording and the slides, and we'll make sure that you all have contact information for OpenComp as well as access to their resources, so we can continue to strengthen our approach to comp throughout the field. But thank you all for being here today.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.